All right, AP World History students, this is an introduction to the long essay question, or the LEQ essay. This is one of the three essay types we have to learn in this class. We will learn it first because I think that the skills we learn here are really applicable to the other ones. It will not be simple at first, but it's going to be a really essential skill for us, and we are going to practice it. So today is really just about introducing you to the rubric, the basic concepts of it, and then I'm going to give you a bunch of practice opportunities with it. So this essay will just ask you to sort of take what you've learned and apply it and write essentially a 5-paragraph essay. The stress for the LEQ is that on the national exam, at least, you won't know what, you're just going to get put on the spot. You're going to get three prompts. You have to pick one and write a 5-paragraph essay about it. And that could be stressful. Now, I'm not going to put that kind of stress in front of you for quite a while. For really the whole first half of the year, you'll always have a sense, at least several days in advance, of like, here's some questions I might ask you about and give you a chance to prepare in advance. In LEQ, you can get a score from a 0 to a 6. A 6 is pretty rare, but it might happen from time to time in our class. 0 is also pretty rare. I don't think any of you are going to get zeros. But everything in between is stuff that's bound to happen. All right. So we're aiming, in general, at a 4. A 4 is a really terrific score. A 4 is like the equivalent of maybe a B plus in our course, and a 5 is like a nice A, and a 6 would be kind of the equivalent of like an A plus. Wow, crazy, over the top. That was remarkable. And on the national exam, we're kind of aiming at, if we can get 3 points on this LEQ, that's a good thing for us. So, and I'll tell you how you get all those points. What's going to happen, you're going to get you're going to get a prompt. And the very typical language for the prompt is going to ask you, it's going to use the phrase, evaluate the extent to which something. All right. So as an example, from a couple years ago, one of the prompts on the national exam was evaluate the extent to which globalization transformed the world's economy in the period 1950 to 2001. All right. So in this case, whenever it says evaluate the extent to which, this is trying to set you up to make an argument, all right, to stake a claim. It's not a yes or no thing. All right. You're not going to get yes or no questions. You're going to get, imagine some gradients. So in this case where it says evaluate the extent to which globalization transformed the world's economy, let's imagine these sort of two poles, right? And on one side is like total transformation, everything changed, there was nothing that was the same. And all the way on the other side we have, there was no transformation occurred, everything was completely the same. Nothing new was introduced. And you need to sort of like stake your claim in there as you make your argument. Like, there was some change, but overall more things stayed the same, or most things changed, but there were some continuities, right? In general, the best LEQs are going to be built around three arguments. And so I'd say if you can have if you have two things that changed and one thing that stayed the same, or two things that stayed the same or one thing that changed, that would be, the kind of thing you're looking for. Now you might say, I have no idea about globalization transforming the world's economy. Mr. Welly, I bet we're not even going to learn that till April. And I'd say, you're right, we aren't going to learn that till April. But here's one that you do know about right now. Evaluate the extent to which COVID-19 transformed the school experience at Southwest Christian High School in the 2020-21 school year. Now that's one where you can start to say, okay, so to what extent did that change things? And where on this spectrum would I stake my claim and make my argument? And what sorts of things would I be pointing toward or giving specific evidence for? All these prompts are going to, built into them, they all ask you to use one of our historical thinking skills in our course, all right? It might be a comparison prompt that's asking you to find similarities or differences, all right? It might be a causation prompt that's asking you to find causes or effects, or it might be a CCOT, changes in continuity over time, that's asking you to find changes or continuities. The ones we just looked at were CCOT prompts. All right, they're asking you to find changes and continuities. And again, you're going to build it around three arguments And your best bet is to have don't just do 3 changes or 3 continuities, but have some mix, some hybrid in between, all right? And if it's asking you to compare things, don't just give 3 similarities or 3 differences. Have some mix, some blend of those. And just because that allows you to sort of stake a claim on that spectrum of to what extent something is similar or different, to what extent something changes, to what extent did one thing cause another thing, all right? So that's some of the basics. You'll get a prompt, you have to sort of try to think of maybe 3 things you can say about that. 2 things can get you through sometimes. 3 is much better. Where does that land you on that spectrum? That's some of the first thinking stuff that happens. You need to be asking yourself, all right, am I coming up with causes and effects here? Am I coming up with similarities and differences or changes and continuities? And I'd say when in doubt there, just really answer the question. Just look at that prompt carefully. Make sure you're answering the prompt. The way that these 5 paragraphs will work is this. There's an introduction paragraph, and the introduction paragraph gives something called contextualization, which I'll talk about in a second, and it provides the thesis for your argument, where you're just summarizing, here's the argument I'm going to make here. Then there are 2 or 3 body paragraphs. Again, 3 is better, because 3 means you have 3 different things you're going to argue, all right? 2 similarities and 1 differences, or 2 continuities and 1 change, right? So, and in those body paragraphs, you always start with a topic sentence that describes, well, here's the argument I'm going to make here in this body paragraph, and then you're giving specific, detailed examples, and there's something called complexity, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And then at the end is your conclusion. And in your conclusion, I just want you to try to write a thesis again, right? Now this time you're probably going to do a better job. You just have a better sense of what you're arguing and what you have said in the body paragraph. So again, restate your thesis. It's really, really common, students, where the first thesis doesn't quite work, or it isn't maybe detailed enough, or maybe there's some little piece that's missing, but the second time a student attempts to write it at the end, once they've written the bulk of the paper, then they really nail it. This is not something, of course, you're writing on a Google Doc. You can't go back and edit it. You're writing it out in real time. And the national exam, you're writing it out in real time in a 45-minute time frame. So this is something where it's typically your first thesis is written in a bit of a frenzy, and by the end you're thinking just a little bit more clearly on it. So I always say, try and write it again. Don't just use the same language. That's just a waste of time. It's a waste of ink. It's a waste of my time to read it. But you're just trying in different language to write your thesis again. Oftentimes students pick up that thesis point there. Let's actually look at the rubric and what this looks like what the scorer is looking for. Because what's happening is your reader, for most of the year, which is me, your reader is hunting. Your reader is like a hunter-gatherer looking for points to give to you. And there are these 6 points. And I, as the reader, when I'm giving out these 6 points, I'm looking for very specific things. There's all kinds of stuff you might be trying and attempting, or all kinds of things that maybe in an English class you're doing that your English teacher would tell you to do, and I'll say, that's fine, but that's not really what gives you any points here in this. These are the 6 specific things I'm looking for. The first one, and I would argue the most important, is the thesis point. Your thesis must give a specific, historically defensible just means accurate, a specific, accurate claim that responds to the prompt. All right. So if you're talking about how did COVID-19 transform the school experience, you're not just saying it made it much weirder and more impersonal or something like that. You have to get specific about what changed and what stayed the same. It has to be accurate, right? You can't say everyone in the building stayed 9 feet apart. That's just not what's happening, right? We're aiming at 3 or 6 feet apart. And so you have to be accurate in your thesis. It has to be specific. Now, like I was saying in Mr. Burka's class, if you watch that video, it's really a good idea to have the first sentence. Your thesis is going to be 2 or 3 sentences, right? The first sentence should be maybe a summary sentence that kind of broadly defines things, and it must be followed up with another sentence or 2 that's giving the specific similarities and differences, changes and continuities, causes and effects specifically. You don't need to give detailed evidence for them yet, but it's giving me some specifics. It's starting to explain them, all right? It needs to use key terms from the prompt. So the prompt says about it said, did COVID-19 transform the school experience at Southwest Christian High School in the 2020-21 school year? You have to reuse all those key terms. Just pretend like whoever's reading the prompt Whoever's reading your essay doesn't know what the prompt is, all right? So you have to kind of like backwards word this. Word your thesis in a way that has the prompt in it so that your reader understands, okay, here's what I'm reading about, all right? Just imagine that your paper is like a book, but someone asked you a question to prompt you to write the book, it's like Yali's question, and you have to sort of work the question back into the statements that you're making. The other thing that happens in this first paragraph is what's called contextualization. All right, and I'll get into more of this in a second, but basically contextualization is how I'll actually encourage you to start that first paragraph. And it's basically saying, so here's the backstory, here's the situation, all right? Here's a broader context. I'm like zoomed way out. Here's a broader context of what's going on before we get to the specific question. So in the case of the one about COVID, you'd say, so COVID-19, there's a COVID-19 pandemic going on and on planet Earth, and it arrived in whatever, February, March, and it has these kinds of effects. And here's how this specific thing affected school at Southwest Christian High School. So it's like you start really broad, all right? You start by saying a big picture, and then you zoom in, all right? So that's showing that basically if the College Board asks you a question about a specific incident or thing that's happening, you're able to just say, yeah, I can answer that. And I can also tell you kind of where that fits on a global scale, like what's going on, what's the picture, what's leading into this. Evidence is a key part of the LEQ. All right, being able to provide evidence, specific evidence. All right, there's two evidence points you can get here. One that's fairly simple and one that's a little more difficult to get. All right, the simple evidence point just says you can provide a couple specific examples, instances, names, moments, things that happened. A number, and you see this number 4 is in brackets because that's kind of my standard number that I'm using when I'm grading LEQs. On the national exam, you don't know how many you're going to need to get. They'll decide that, but they're not going to tell you in advance. So part of the idea is just put as much evidence as you can think. Put it in your essay. Just blast it all in there. So it says, giving me 4 specific examples relevant to the prompt. What this just means is if you're writing about globalization in the world economy, you can tell me 4 things, 4 specific pieces of evidence. Cell phone satellites, or like massive shipping technology, or the North American Free Trade Agreement, or the European Union. I don't know. Like this would all be like specific things that have to do with that process of globalization. So you can tell me 4 things that are relevant to the prompt. Basically, if the prompt is this big old, like, here's what we're talking about, you can put in 4 details, specific things that are relevant to that. The more advanced, difficult evidence point to get is being able to provide a certain number of evidences that are directly supporting your argument. All right. So if you can provide, let's say 3 is a number I put in here, 3 specific pieces of evidence that, like, I'm talking about how globalization to a large degree transformed the world's economy by eliminating trade barriers. And so there I talk about NAFTA, or the North American Free Trade Agreement, right? And I talk about how it sped up, it relied on sped up communication infrastructure. And so there I'm talking about satellites and cell phones and stuff like this. Okay, those evidences are now being specifically used to support my argument that is responding to the prompt. That's great. Now you'll note here, what that means is, let's say I have 4 pieces of evidence that are being used to support my argument that is responding to the prompt. Well, then I'm definitely getting the hard evidence point. And by definition, I'm also getting the easier evidence point, because it's also, those pieces of evidence are also certainly in that broad, like, it's generally on topic. It has to do with what the prompt is asking you about. So evidence here, I think the key is just give me specifics. And that's a very common refrain you'll see me as a reader give you all year long. I need more specifics. More specific evidence is needed, right? Give specific examples or instances. We need that stuff. The last 2 points. The 5th point here, I think, is fairly straightforward, and I think you aim for this one in the topic sentence of your body paragraphs. So you have 2 or 3 body paragraphs. In your topic sentence, you're going to be aiming for this. And this is just basically saying, are you describing the changes or the continuities? Are you describing the similarities or the differences? All right. And I think if you're writing a body paragraph, let's say about the COVID-19 transforming the school experience one, and you say, one stark difference, one stark change in the school experience is now everyone at school is wearing masks, and last year they weren't. There you go. You've just described a change in one of the body paragraphs. Now, you'll probably give some supporting evidence and some supporting detail and everything else, and that goes into your evidence point. But just by describing it in a body paragraph, you have picked up that point. All right? And so this one is kind of, if you've got a thesis that works and you just take the time to kind of describe what you're talking about in a body paragraph, you're going to pick this one up. This is a pretty straightforward point to get. Most students will get this point most of the time. The only reason why students don't get this is if they really misunderstand the prompt, right? They end up talking about their friend who goes to whatever, Edina High School, and it was all, hybrid learning, or it was all distance learning, and it's like, yeah, but the prompt asked about Southwest Christian High School. So everything you're telling me about Edina is neat, thanks, I'm sad for your friend, but it doesn't get the point, right? Like you got to be on prompt. The last point is the unicorn point, as we call it. It's really hard to get. And this basically shows not only can I answer the question, not only can I load you up with evidence, I can play jazz with this thing. I can start riffing with this thing. I can find all kinds of, not only describe what's going on, I can explain why all this stuff is happening. And I can explain the causes of them. I can explain the effects of what all these changes were. I can provide nuance, right? Like, or qualifiers, like everyone is wearing masks except some people aren't, and here's the situation with some people who weren't, and here's what the effects of that were, and here's, you're kind of like, you aren't just describing it in somewhat straightforward terms, like you're really describing it in complex terms. This whole point is called historical complexity. Or you're able to relate it, you're able to say, and all these things that were happening here are very similar to this other thing that was happening in this other place at this other time in history, or this other school. I'm relating it to something else that's going on elsewhere, all right? Or you're going beyond giving me 2 or 3 similarities or differences, changes or continuities. You're giving me more. This is just like if you just load up the reader and you show them, not only do I understand this topic, not only can I describe it and provide you some specific evidence and even contextualize it, I can just dominate it. I can go on and on and on. I have no shortage of things I can do with this. This is a very difficult point to pick up, but it's we have students that grab it from time to time. It's the complexity point. All right, moving ahead. So this first paragraph, again, in the opening paragraph, I just want to encourage you, don't sit there and go, from the dawn of time, people have pondered, when can we have more global connections with one another? Like this kind of flowery introduction gives you, it gives you 0 points. There's just no points on the rubric for it. And sometimes students sit there and puzzle and ponder over what their opening words should be. And I would just say, ditch the opening words, right? There is like a gun pointed at your head and a clock ticking. You just got to go. Jump in with the context, all right? You see this sort of Star Wars image here. The contextualization point that you're going to start with is just kind of like that opening scroll in a Star Wars movie where you're saying, it says, it is a time of civil war. The rebels have stolen the plans for the Death Star, and they're trying to escape, and Darth Vader is in hot pursuit, blah, blah, blah. It's like telling you the situation, and then we jump into the prompt. So in context, you're going to spend 2 or 3 sentences describing a broader historical situation, the broader historical picture, and then you get into answering the prompt, which is your thesis, all right? I'd say on your thesis, a thing I'll just keep hammering all year long, and we'll keep working on this, is just make certain you are answering the prompt. Make certain you understand the prompt. AP does not stand for advanced placement. AP stands for answer the prompt. And that sounds simple, and I'm sure you're sitting there watching this video go, yeah, I know, of course. And it will happen to you where it's like you misunderstand the prompt, or there's one word you miss, or as you start writing, you just are like getting misaligned from the prompt, and now you're off prompt, and I'm your reader going, this isn't what's being asked of you, right? And so your thesis, again, context, in order to work, in order to have enough stuff to it, will be 2 or 3 sentences. A thesis in AP World History, in order to work, to have enough meat in the bone, 2 or 3 sentences. There's your opening paragraph. Here's an example opening paragraph I'll share. All right. Again, the prompt is evaluate the extent to which globalization transformed the world's economy. Prior to the Second World War, the world's economy was not nearly as integrated as it is today. Gripped by the Great Depression, nations raised tariffs and trade restrictions in an effort to protect jobs, and many leading nations, like the United States, tended toward isolationism. After World War II, with the world's economy in shambles, many steps were taken toward what became the age of globalization. There was my context. It's saying, here's the backstory. Here's what this comes out of. Here's the situation immediately preceding what the prompt just asked me about, and I'm describing it, and then I lead it into where we're going. Now, the thesis. Globalization transformed the world's economy to a great extent. So on that spectrum, I'm saying this is a lot of change to a great extent in the period 1950 to 2001. Now my examples. Free trade agreements like NAFTA and the European Union eased trade restrictions between nations, resulting in greater movement of goods, jobs, and people than ever before. So I'm giving some specifics, and I'm suggesting what I'm going to be describing. New technology like satellites and massive shipping freighters sped up the movement of goods and ideas. Yet, while these changes economically benefited all nations, some nations like the United States continue to play a dominant role in world trade. There's my continuity. There's something where I'm saying, look, but here's the thing that stayed the same. You'll note there's a bit of like subtlety or complexity in this. I'm giving some specific detail. And the key thing is you have a very strong sense after reading this what Mr. Welly's 3 body paragraphs will be. In your body paragraphs, again, you're going to want 2 or 3, and each body paragraph should be devoted to a single part of your argument, a single change or continuity, a single similarity or difference. All right. You need to provide evidence in the body paragraphs. The evidence does not go in your thesis, all right? Or if you say something specific in your thesis, you need to say it again in a body paragraph in order to get that point. Okay, so let's read this body paragraph. The establishment of trade unions like NAFTA and the European Union transformed the world's economy by easing the movement of jobs, goods, and people. That is an example, that's a topic sentence. That's where I'm describing the argument. So now I'm going to get into the specifics. The European Union, established in the period following World War II, reduced trade barriers and eventually led to a common currency, the euro, evidence point, used across the continent, with some exceptions like the United Kingdom. The North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, was negotiated in the 1990s between the United States, Mexico, and Canada, and had similar effects, although it wasn't as transformative as the EU. That's complexity, where I'm saying, here's another piece of evidence, but here's a subtle difference between those two. These agreements had some disruptive effects, however, as manufacturing jobs tended to move to nations where labor was cheaper, from the United States to Mexico, for example. Evidence. Also, just as the Columbian Exchange in the 16th century led to the movement of peoples from the Old World to the New World, globalization led to the increased migration of people across Europe and North America, which resulted in some ugly cultural backlash and xenophobia. I'm saying this is, again, I'm aiming for complexity. I'm trying to show you a really, really, really good body paragraph where I'm saying this thing is very similar to this other thing in this other place in this other time, and here's some kind of, even in this change, here's some consequences of it, right? Where I'm trying to demonstrate mastery of this understanding. Guys, that's everything. And that's a lot. I want to acknowledge that's a lot. The practice one you're going to do is not going to be as hard. And we're all just going to put our training wheels on and try this out. And I believe you can do this. I'm excited for what you're going to do. And I promise you, one of my strategies this year in our course is I get our students ready for the LEQ. By the end of the year, you will be LEQ masters. And that only happens through practice. So we're going to begin our practice stuff now. So if you have questions, contact me or talk to a friend. Work together on this. Try the first practice one and see what you think. All right. And I'll be grading leniently at the beginning, I promise. All right, guys, good luck.